Much have I travelled in the realms of gold, and many goodly states and kingdoms seen. Round many western islands have I been, which bards in fealty to Apollo hold. By John Keats, from On First Looking into Chapman's Homer.
Welcome to Epigraphs. I'm Ted,
And I'm Maria.
and we're sitting down today because we're going to talk about epics, the epics,
The epics.
the epics, and uh, I love the epics. There's some of them that I haven't read that I will publicly admit to not having read, but I have spent a lot of time with the epics.
There are plenty that I haven't read, and some I was realizing as I was thinking about this that I've read halfway through and then stopped. Because we might as well get it out there. One of the things that makes something epic is that it's long.
Yes, which we're going to also reference quite a bit. C.S. Lewis's preface to Paradise Lost, which I've read a long time ago, and you've never read, but it's still a fantastic book about epics. And I think it's in that work that he talks about modern people's difficulty reading an epic, and he describes the experience which, if you've ever been to a used bookstore and gone to the classic section, you will almost certainly have experienced, which is, say you crack open a translation of the Aeneid or a Paradise Lost, and for the first 10 pages there's all sorts of underlining and like notes and, oh, that's great, and something like that, and then you keep reading and nothing else. There's no other markings on the rest of the book. The point there being that epics are not something that is about pithy statements, about the turn of phrase. Sure, there's some of that, but they're enormous works that can't be cut down to some small piece. So when I think of the epics, and this is pulling from Lewis's Paradise Lost, the sort of the backbone,
His preface to Paradise Lost.
his preface to Paradise Lost, the backbone, which is actually a book in its own right, which is pretty funny. It's not actually a preface to Paradise Lost. It's a whole book about epics, and particularly about Paradise Lost. But the backbone of the Western canon, in terms of the epics, he delineates as the two Homeric epics. So you have the Iliad and the Odyssey, which they're connected in their story.
And those I have read.
Those you have read. I haven't read the Iliad. So I've read the Odyssey a couple of times. I've tried the Iliad 2-3 times, and haven't. I just lost the thread every time.
I think it's actually very common for modern readers to find the Odyssey much more compelling than the Iliad.
Well, yeah. So that's a great point. So
But sorry, go ahead and say the other
the Iliad
ones.
and the Odyssey, and then you have Virgil's the Aeneid, which
I read, but not since college.
that comes right before the time of Christ. So it's actually quite a bit later, and in a very different context. And then even later than that, you have the Divine Comedy by Dante. So that's out of the classical world. That's firmly planted in the early Renaissance, and then Paradise Lost, which is the only of the 5 that's actually even in English and can be read in the original language. But your point of
Well, if you're an English speaker,
if you're an
and
English
nothing
speaker,
else.
I do mean you, you specifically, and me. I can sort of brutally walk my way through a little bit of the Italian in Dante, but your point about the Odyssey was interesting because that was actually the first time that I realized that I could engage on my own with good literature. My freshman year of college, I think it was because I listened to Josh Garrel's Love and War in the Sea in Between album that fall, and he had a song called Ulysses about Odysseus, which I found very compelling, and I thought, I'd love to actually read the Odyssey, and I got halfway through it on my Kindle and realized that, lo and behold, I was reading an epic poem. It was a prose translation, but that aside, I was reading one of the epics for fun on my own and really enjoying it. And that kind of turned this major switch in me that said, hey, this is like, you can do this. And not only can you do this, you want to do this. You want to read this stuff. And to your point about the Odyssey, what shocked me about it was not this boring, linear slog, but the storytelling in it is very interesting. There's lots of where you start right in the middle of the action, and then you get all this stuff backwards, and you're hearing about the past and you're moving forward, and so the structure is very non-linear. It's actually what people now think they're in the last, say, 100 years of storytelling feel like they invented, here are all these interesting ways to play with narrative and time, and it's like, well, the Odyssey did that.
Just kind of as a side note, I met a guy last summer so the Odyssey is set up where you meet Odysseus in the middle of the action,
Yes.
and most of what happens before that is actually Odysseus narrating it.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, we know from everything that happens after that point that Odysseus lies all the time. So his theory is we actually have no trustworthy information about what happened to Odysseus
wow.
before the beginning of the book, where it opens.
Which I guess firmly plants the Odyssey as the first postmodern novel. With an unreliable narrator and a weird, broken up, nonlinear story. That's fascinating.
But let's go back to some basics. So one of the things I was actually hoping we could talk about is what qualifies something as an epic. So I was thinking about it. There are those 5 core ones. No one's going to dispute that those are epics. But then you get these other things that are really long works. Sometimes they're telling stories. Sometimes they're not. And they seem to tap into some of the same kinds of concerns as epics sometimes. So I've got things in mind like Idols of the King by Tennyson.
Yes,
I
yeah,
don't think that counts. But I'm not sure. There's a novel, not a novel. It's a travel book, basically, but it's enormous, from the mid-1900s. It's called... I always get it backwards. It's either Grey Lamb and Black Falcon or Black Lamb and Grey Falcon by Rebecca West.
Yeah.
And and she's traveling in the Balkans, and it goes into the history of all these places that she's going. So it feels sort of like that origin story that some of the epics have. That's one of the ones that I'm only halfway through.
Well...
And then the other big one, another one that I'm only halfway through, but I'm actually actively reading this one, is Augustine City of God, which...
interesting.
And Alan Jacobs has actually just started blogging his way a series on City of God, so a little bit of this is inspired by that. But he points out that Augustine very obviously positions himself in reference to the Aeneid. And he's offering a different account of where the world came from, basically, and where the world's going. But it's not a narrative.
Yeah.
Is it an epic?
Again, I'm gonna sort of pull the Barfield thing and say that no one who's really interested in definition looks in a dictionary, and so I'm just gonna maybe there's some academic definition of an epic out there, and
yeah,
fine.
But neither of us know it. So
neither of us know it, and I don't. In some sense, that doesn't matter. I think that you have the noun, right? The epics, and then you have epic writing. And so, for instance, The Lord of the Rings, I would consider that to be like an epic novel. And so there it goes from a noun to an adjective, because it has those epic qualities to it. But I would consider an epic to be a long form, cosmically, in some way, cosmically involved narrative poem.
Okay.
So those would be the things that I would say, for me to be convinced that it's an epic, it would need to be it needs to be very long. It needs to be a poem, so it needs to be at least originally told in verse, even if you're reading a prose translation of it.
Okay, so that immediately rules out City of God and
the
Rebecca West.
Yes, exactly. So, but I would add in Beowulf. Beowulf definitely, to my mind, fits firmly within the category of the epics. One that I think is really interesting, the only argument would be maybe for the length. I would consider the Book of Job actually to be an epic poem. And in that sense, it's a very interesting epic poem. So let me bring up a distinction that you and I were talking a little bit about, that C.S. Lewis has in Preface to Paradise Lost, which this is probably, if there's one thing that stuck in my mind when I read it 10 years ago, actually, this is the 10-year anniversary of the one time I read Preface to Paradise Lost. So clearly some of this stuff stuck in there. But he talks about the difference between the two Homeric epics, and there's a corner that got turned at the Aeneid. And one of the things that's interesting about the Aeneid, I think you brought up that it's primary, he calls them the primary epics and the secondary epics, and the primary epics are the Homeric epics. What's interesting is the Aeneid is structurally, the first half is basically the Odyssey told from the point of view of the Trojans rather than the Greeks, and the second half of it is the Iliad, but it's taking place on the peninsula of Italy instead of outside of Troy. And so I think very shamelessly and intentionally, and Virgil is taking the structure of the epics that he grew up under as a writer and turning them, he's transforming them into something that he wants to do with them. Which you again see, especially with, right? Because then Virgil shows up as one of the main characters in the Divine Comedy.
Yeah. And so what I understand the basic distinction there to be is that secondary epics are self-consciously being epics.
So yeah, so that's one part. Another distinction that Lewis brings up that I find deeply interesting in terms of, because of how deep it goes, is he talks about the Homeric epics as being a picture of a fundamentally cyclic universe. Mm-hmm. So the Trojan War is worthy of song because of the great deeds done, but Troy is burned to the ground. Everyone kind of goes their way, goes home, and you don't feel like the world has turned a corner. Great things have been done, but the gods, used men as their proxies for a struggle, like they always do. And Zeus is going to go on philandering. Hera is going to go around pulling Zeus's hair, and like men are going to do glorious things and end up as ghosts in the underworld. And with the Odyssey, Odysseus comes home and he drives the young suitors out of his house, and peace is sort of reestablished. But it's very much a thing of, glad we got through all that, so business as usual can continue. I can grow old and venerable in my home.
And actually, Odysseus' journey is not done at the end of the Odyssey. I don't know if you remember this, but he still has to continue on until he has to continue journeying until he reaches a place where they don't recognize oars for what they are.
Yes.
So I think there's some speculation that maybe there was a third Homeric epic.
Oh, interesting. I'd actually heard in relation to that add-on with the whole saga of the oar as his way of appeasing Neptune is something that was tacked on much later. Mm. Because originally it was supposed to end, he's home, he's reestablished with Penelope and his son, and that later on, for whatever reason, people thought, oh yeah, we need to add this other thing on at the end. Interesting. Yeah. Well, and that's one of the interesting things is that the epics, especially my impression of the two Homeric epics, is that they're enormous to the and they have kind of fuzzy edges, and so and this is another thing that you immediately realize when you approach the epics is that they are an education in and of themselves. They both presuppose a tremendous amount of knowledge outside of them, and also educate you on a tremendous number of things. Mm-hmm. And so of those five, the one that I've spent the most time with far and away is the Divine Comedy. And as anyone who's ever picked up the Divine Comedy will know, that it is completely rife with classical references, biblical references, contemporary Italian Renaissance references. And Dante is bringing everything to bear on it. One of the best examples of that. I mean, the story itself is essentially told through people that he brings in. Mm-hmm. It's 100 cantos of cameos, essentially.
You need to know who they are from outside the poem, or the poem doesn't make sense.
Exactly, and so you have they're interesting in that they're really, really deeply embedded in the world, and particularly in the term that I got from Jonathan Peugeot and Richard Rowland on Jonathan Peugeot's podcast, the term of universal history, which is really, I think it sheds a lot of light on sort of the epic project. So particularly thinking about Dante. So okay, so let's go back. I got to go back. I want to finish up the primary and secondary epic thing because this is really important. So the primary epics, the world is basically unchanged even though men have done great deeds. Mm-hmm. In the secondary epics, something happens. The world is not the same because of the things that have happened in the story of the epic, which strikes me as kind of what people think epics are about now.
And so, yes, when I had just heard the primary-secondary distinction without that element of it, just the self-consciousness, and was thinking about Homeric versus Aeneid on, the thing that I immediately thought was that the secondary epics feel like they are origin stories. How did we get where we are, instead of the sort of snapshot of a culture field that the earlier epics have. Like, this is the pinnacle of... Well, it's not all the pinnacle, but we are going to show you some of the best ways that people can live. We're going to sing their glorious deeds.
And you might be able to help me out on this. This is one of those things I picked up ages ago, but that the Homeric epics were seen as, I said as an education, but like really meant as an education. Like when you read the story, this is how you slaughter bulls to the gods. This is how you're supposed to speak to a man. this is how a son treats a father.
I have heard that.
Okay, yeah, I don't know where I picked that up either, but right. So let's say there's an idea floating around.
Our grandmother told us that.
Oh, fast. Okay, there you go. that it
but
really
she
was
actually like taught
classics.
We should clarify.
Yes.
She taught the Iliad and the Odyssey to college students for years.
Reliable source here. Assuming it's her. We should ask her if we can formally cite her on that. But yeah, exactly. So it was seen as Greek on some level, like the encapsulation of Greek culture. If you read and understood this, you could be a Greek man. Mm-hmm. Which is a really interesting, and so but that's different from the Aeneid, which when you read it, it becomes immediately obvious this is about where the Romans came from. And not just where the Romans came from, but who the Romans are and who they're going to be. And so there's this, it adds a really interesting valence to it because, I don't know, there's, at least to my mind, there's some ambiguity there in the Homeric epics in terms of, is it good that the Greeks are fighting with the Trojans? It feels largely tragic. Mm-hmm. Odysseus is held up as he's an extraordinarily competent man. Is he a good man? Quite questionable. Yeah. Aeneas is much more of a hero who has he is tragic because of the divine destiny from heaven placed on him, and so you have like the tragedy of Dido, but that's not because he's a bad man or because he's an incompetent man, but because like destiny has laid its hands on him. Why? Not because he needs to go and do something for his life, but because Zeus has ordained that an eternal kingdom will be established in Rome, and so come hell or high water, Aeneas is going to go there. Mm-hmm. He's going to kill all the people. He's going to marry, this Albion princess and establish the eternal kingdom of Rome.
Yes, but wasn't it Jupiter that ordained all that?
Thank you. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, right. So what's interesting about that, and Beowulf also, Beowulf is a whole nother story on that. What's interesting is that you very quickly get into all the nuance there. So Paradise Lost fits very, very easily into that category. It's not just the origin story of a nation, though. It's the origin story of all the
humanity.
Things of humanity and of the cosmos.
Yeah. And
so in that sort of walking down that path, Paradise Lost is sort of the epic of epics. Like you can't take another step back and say, here's an even bigger picture of where we came from. Mm-hmm. But the interesting thing about the Aeneid and the Trojans, which to us, our modern sensibilities feels like, okay, interesting. I guess that's like someone that we could look at. Pretty much everyone after the Roman Empire saw that as the central thread of history. And so this is one of the things that Peugeot and Roland bring up in their podcast a lot, that there's anthropological evidence of like pretty much everywhere west of Mongolia and north of Ethiopia, you can find people who trace their lineage back to Troy, mythologically. Mm-hmm. Like someone, I think, in the last 15 years found people in either Latvia or Lithuania that said, yeah, we're the descendants of this family from Troy, who, by whatever means, made it all the way up to the Baltic states and settled there. And so there's this sense in which something like the Aeneid and the story of Aeneas fleeing Troy and establishing Rome becomes this sort of I don't want to say secular because that's a really modern thing to think of it. This mythological foundation, as opposed to the connected alongside the Bible, this way of realizing who you are. Mm-hmm. And so in that sense, it actually plays a similar role to what you were talking about with the primary epics, but in a different way. It's not here's who we are; it's here's where we came from.
It's more like linear self-definition.
Yes.
So it is a way of defining where you are, but it's by means of how you got there.
Yes.
Not by means of some sort of static staying in place. This is how we've always been.
Yes.
This is how we have come to be this way.
Yes. Which is really interesting for many reasons. One of them being, though, that and I wish I could pull where this one came from. I want to say it's Owen Barfield's Saving the Appearances, but the contention that it's the first place that you get that sort of arrow of time, that directionality of history, is in the Old Testament. That is what fundamentally set the Hebrew people apart from everyone else in all of history before them. And for me to even say that presupposes the Hebrew view of the world, which is that things started and they changed and they're headed somewhere. So you have paradise and eschaton, the eschaton, right? You have the goal, and that sort of thing that we're living in between those two is really, that's a fundamental part of the epics, I think. They take such a large view of the world, maybe the secondary epics, I'll say. They take such a large view of things that you end up being cemented in that. So you have, and the Aeneid is set somewhere between the reign of Saturn and the establishment of the eternal kingdom of Rome.
Mm-hmm.
And then the Pax Romana, the thing that brings about the rule of heaven on earth. With Paradise Lost, right, it's, well, you have paradise, that's pretty clear. And then the last part of it is looking forward towards the redemption, and he even, Milton even goes on to write Paradise Regained.
Don't you think you're kind of straining the interpretation on that one?
If it was ever legitimate. Okay, but here's what's so interesting to me is the Divine Comedy is such a, when you start drawing those lines with the epics, the Divine Comedy is so weird because of how personal it is. Mm-hmm. Because it has that same, and I think Dante was a genius on multiple levels, but one of them is his ability to take that epic pattern and write himself, his own life in that. Mm-hmm. And so when we're looking at that, I would say you have the paradisal age for him, which is when he was living in the full vision of the love of Beatrice. And then there's some fall, and we find him in media res, lost in the dark woods, because he's forgotten Beatrice. And then it's that vision of Beatrice that calls him, and he ends up in this sort of personal eschaton, right? Where he ends up in the beatific vision, right? So one of the things that's so interesting about that is his ability to walk that whole path in one person, in himself. And I don't know. I mean, that's really interesting. We're talking about the need to know the people in the story too. There's something just deeply personal about the Divine Comedy. So maybe you want to push back on my argument about it needing to be cosmological. Is the Divine Comedy a cosmic epic, cosmic poem?
It literally takes him through his entire universe.
Okay, sure. Thank you. Yeah.
So on that level, at least, it's cosmic. And I think that strongly suggests to us that on one level, it is a person's life. But
yes. Yeah.
On another level, it is the story of humanity.
Yes. So that's really interesting, because one of the things that I think Dante does compared to the earlier epics is the symbolism that he uses is much more self-conscious. So instead of it being about, right, the literal founding of Troy, or of Rome, the literal battle outside of Troy, that then is raised this sort of high level when we're talking about it in a poem, he uses individual people to become symbols or images of huge spiritual realities.
So even though Dante is just one person, he is traveling through a path that shows you myriad ways in which people can go wrong, basically.
Yes.
And then go right.
Yes. Yeah.
So he is almost taking a tour of an immense number of people's journeys through the same territory.
Yeah, it's sort of like it ends up almost being a metaphysical epic, which is a strange. In some sense, it's not about the great wars or the great doings. It is about sort of the pattern behind all of it. And so it's funny that there's such an obsession these days with visual media that everything gets tied together. I think of the massive snarled knot that is the comic book cinematic universes, and how people get this like, oh man, there's 5 seconds where there's that one character from that other movie, and that's so interesting, and then there's other people that roll their eyes about that, and can we not have a standalone, can we not come up with new stories or standalone things or whatever?
But you know what? Anthony Trollope did it all first.
Right. I mean, Dante did it all first. So you have all these fascinating.
He didn't write other works of literature with overlapping characters, did he?
No, I mean, he did write other stories that have a lot to do with Beatrice, and then some other characters in Florence that he then writes into his novel. But into his epic. But he takes all sorts of, I mean, basically everything that he'd ever gotten his hands on that had been written end up in there. And so what's so interesting is that you can actually, and I don't know about you maybe lose that thread by Paradise Lost, but you have Odysseus, who has his exploits in the Odyssey, who then gets transformed into Ulysses, who's basically this really treacherous loser who's been sailing around the Eastern Mediterranean before Aeneas comes through. And then he shows up again in hell in the Divine Comedy. And his story is transformed each time. And so you have him as this sort of trickster who makes it through in the Odyssey into this treacherous man who's willing to abandon all of his shipmates just to get home.
I would say he's more than that in the Odyssey.
Sure.
He's Athena's favorite.
Yes.
He's Wile E. Coyote from
he's kind of
however many hundred years BC that
he's
nobody
sort of
knows exactly.
He's sort of the Greek of the Greeks.
Yeah.
In that sense. Yeah. And then he's all the negatives of that are really brought out in the Aeneid when they're kind of coming along. At one point they find some abandoned former shipmates of Ulysses where they left him on an island, and so then of course Aeneas comes and rescues them. One of the things that's really interesting is there's this really shocking image in the Aeneid where I can't remember if someone's been murdered. I think he's been murdered, and his blood on this island, and his blood has like soaked into this tree. And so when Aeneas comes along, they're going to start a fire, and someone breaks the branches off, and instead of sap, his blood is oozing out, and he speaks out of the tree. Out of this blood oozing out of the tree, and you think, oh, that's a weird image, and sure enough it is. Well, Dante comes along later, and in the Wood of the Suicides, the Inferno, everyone who's committed suicide is a tree that is in the exact same place, and so Virgil tells tells Dante, break a branch off of there, and then the suicide is like speaking out of this limb. So there's this real sense in which these images are taken up and used over and over, and so then Ulysses shows up amongst the false counselors, and there, the telling that Dante has is Ulysses tells his shipmates they've been on the sea for years and years and years, and they end up at the Straits of Gibraltar. And Ulysses, instead of taking them home like a good leader would, he betrays all of his men in his lust for discovery and gets them all to sail west out into the Atlantic. And then they sail and sail and sail, and then they see Mount Purgatory. And because no living man is supposed to see Mount Purgatory except by God's will, a wind comes and sinks their ships after like 3 months at sea. Now, what's fascinating is that to me is that the thing that Dante the writer is to having Ulysses, the Dantean Ulysses, tell the story to Virgil and Dante the character, and he's relaying the argument that he's having with his men on the ship, and he says, "Are we men or beasts? Let's sail west while we have life."
Mm-hmm. And if you've ever read The Voyages of the Dawn Treader,
yes.
then you've basically read his speech.
Yes, exactly. And so you see the whole thing is woven together, and so you can roll your eyes about cameos and things being connected, but this is like the whole epic project is to weave the whole thing together. But it's the biblical corpus, it's the mythological corpus, and it's the historical corpus, which strikes us as very strange as moderns, generally. Because,
you mean in Dante specifically?
In Dante specifically, because we're like, no, those things don't fit together. Mm-hmm. But he's got them all rubbing shoulders, in hell, in purgatory, and up in heaven. And there's really not those distinctions made there, because he's trying to bring all of it in, which Richard Rollin and Pajot bring up that was kind of how Europe understood itself, was through that, what they call the universal history, where you connect everything back to Troy. Thank you, Aeneid. The Aeneid's very helpful for that. And you connect everything back to the list of nations in Genesis after the flood. And so there's this idea of how can we embed ourselves. That's very much like you were saying about the later epics. We know who we are because of where we came from. And so that kind of becomes the project of every culture in Europe has that story for themselves. Here's how we came from Rome. Here's how we came from the Bible.
If you read some of the medieval English chronicles, it's kind of startling. The genealogies will just be going along with all those classic early British sounding names that you can't pronounce, and then all of a sudden you're at Noah's sons.
Surely you hit Albion in there somewhere, don't you?
I I don't know. I just remember suddenly getting. I think it was Shem.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, it was Shem,
Yep.
the son of Noah.
Yep, and then all the way back to
all
Adam.
the way back to Adam.
Yeah.
Yep.
Oh, that's so interesting. Yeah, there's this desire, and I think that's what. Okay, so I want to shift this a little bit and start talking about what it's like to read epics and how I have a certain approach to them that I think is different from other things that I read, and like why read epics, why have people read epics, and there's this. Well, there's a bunch of different ways to start with this. One of them is they're enormously deep, and so I think I'd be curious to hear what you think of. I've been thinking about the depth of a text, and my really like high level definition of depth is, if you will, is the ability to continue to bear out new things for you as you read it.
So what some people might call richness.
Yeah, I would say, well, it's like a deep work. I would say that's
Or fruitfulness.
or fruitfulness. So but I also want to make a further distinction in there and see if you think that if those should be called different things. One is say the Divine Comedy. I can spend a lot of time with the Divine Comedy. I can say study the poetic structure of it. I can study the references to it, and I can realize, oh, there was more there than I thought. In that sense, I didn't realize that he organized purgatory in this way. I didn't see the connection between his ordering of sins and the way St. Thomas Aquinas talks about sin in the Summa. Something like that. Another way is I can come back to the Divine Comedy after 10 years of living my life, and my life experience makes it a much richer thing. I'm realizing, oh, I didn't realize how true it was. Mm-hmm. So those are, like, I would almost say that like the first one is like a rich text in the sense of like a rich tapestry. There's a lot there. The other one is more like, as I come to it with more wisdom, which
I would call it a resonant text, I think.
Okay.
And resonant in the full musical sense of having like richness of sound, and it reverberates. I don't want to say echoes because that sounds hollow in some ways, actually. But it combines with other things as well.
Okay.
And to pull the analogy out a little further, like it creates new harmonies.
Well,
when you bring new experience to it.
So a month or two ago, I came across a professor who defined symbol, or not defined, gave the etymology of symbol and symbolic, which has been fascinating to me. It's sim meaning together, and bolos meaning to throw. So a symbol is that things that are thrown together. Mm-hmm. And so when you said it ends up matching up with other things. It comes together with other things. Oh, and then I think about symbol. Also, the etymological antonym of symbol is diabolic, where we get diabolic, which is to throw apart. The diabolic is that which throws apart, and the symbolic is that which throws together, which there's a lot to consider there. I really like that, though, because when I think about what was it that when I read the Odyssey the first time, it's the clearest with the Odyssey to me. And it's interesting that, like, I don't really like reading translated poetry in general, but I have no problem reading translated epics. It doesn't bother me at all. Mm-hmm. And I remember after I read the Odyssey, and I had visual images of it, and when I thought about the things that happened in the Odyssey, I had no other way of saying it then. The sun was brighter, and the sea was richer in color. There was something about it that, it had this, hypersaturation of meaning to it, to the degree that I went back to the text and said, where did that come from? Mm-hmm. And I couldn't find anything in the descriptions.
Huh.
And so then that connects in my mind. Dorothy Sayers has got a fantastic essay on Dante. If you're scared of the Divine Comedy, and feel intimidated by it, one of the first thing I would say is just read it, and don't read any footnotes. Just read it all the way through. The other thing that if you can't manage that, then I would say read Dorothy Sayers' essay on it called "And Telling You a Story." And she brings up a very interesting thing that she noticed, which is that she had a friend who talks about how she was, oh, I love Purgatorio. Okay, well, why do you love Purgatorio? Well, it's so colorful, such a rich landscape. So she and her friend went back and looked, and there's almost no descriptions of the way Purgatorio looks. There's almost no visual descriptions. There's a little bit in the veil of the where the rulers are, the earthly rulers are, and there's like this interesting thing where a snake is coming and it's driven off by angels with a broken sword. There's a little bit of like, there's some beautiful flowers. But it is like a consistent thing for people to read it and just be struck with how visually rich and beautiful Purgatory is. Even though there's like no visual descriptions of it.
Well, that poem that we started with, the Keats poem on first looking into Chapman's Homer, later on, he's describing his first experience of reading Homer, at least in this particular translation by George Chapman. And he says, I heard Chapman speak out loud and bold, then felt I like some watcher of the skies when a new planet swims into his ken. So there's something about that experience that is broadening, doesn't feel like quite the right word, but it does have some new element of experience, it seems, to many, many people, which is a curious thing, given that one of the, I think, as I understand it, historically characteristic of epics is that they're really, really familiar. Like, if your culture has an epic, then you know it.
That is interesting. Well, again, one of the things that's to that point, I've also found that I am always surprised at how much of them I remember. Obviously, with the exception of the Iliad, which I had a hard time with. But I still know a lot about the Iliad, which is interesting. And I mean, there's the story was fascinating. We had a picture book. I don't know if you remember this growing up. Black
Ships Before Troy.
Yes. So that's, the story is there, but there's some particular staying power of the epics too
they're sticky.
They're sticky. Yes, they're very sticky. They're deeply sticky. That's sounds unpleasant, but it's actually great. And you almost begin to get the sense why, for instance, Dante is constantly referencing the earlier epics, because they did that to him too. And so it's much more like I get the impression that it's something much more like the authors are stepping into this thing rather than, say, writing this thing. It's much more they've like entered into the stream, and then we as readers get to do that as well. I mean, it's interesting. I don't know if it's the same, but I also, when I read Paradise Lost, which was the summer after my freshman year of college, and again, that's English and it's in blank verse. Thank you. And very weird. My understanding is he's trying to imitate the sound of Latin verse in English. But I do remember reading it, and it was one of my first encounters with poetry. Probably a bad idea, but it was great, and I loved it. But I remember this.
But don't try this at home.
But don't try this at home. Yeah, read something else. I was like, I really am interested in like getting to know some poetry. It's like, well, I could read a couple of Hopkins poems. I think I'll read Paradise Lost. But coming to this, having this impression over and over of, oh, of course he said that word. Of course that was the word. And then I'd go back and I could never figure out why. It was like, of course that was the word. Then you end up with these, there's this interesting interplay that's going on in my mind when I read the epics, which is the whole thing is contained within itself in such a way that I can't say, here's that phrase. There's not like the pithy phrase, the one thing. It like rises to these particular moments, say, Satan's monologue outside of the Garden of Eden, right? That's a great one, and it does come to this, I'm going to bring hell wherever I am, I bring hell inside myself am hell, right? There are great lines like that, but there's
But that's not the point.
That's
of
not
it.
the point. It is something about the whole thing lets you be there and realize that you could be the kind of creature that is capable of looking at earthly paradise and realizing that you would like to pull it apart leaf by leaf because you're just such a bad sport.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I hold like there. I have a lot of awe. I think is probably the word that I'd say about
Mm-hmm.
that. And it's a weird kind of awe because I don't think I need to go and read Paradise Lost every year.
Mm-hmm.
I don't read it very often, but like it's kind of like alive inside of me.
I'm also thinking about a definition that I read one time. I think it was an Italo Calvino essay on what is a classic. It's one of those things that shows up if you're reading about classical education, you're going to find it linked to. And he offers something like 20 different definitions of a classic. But
Goodness.
one of the ones that, and they all sort of build on each other. And
Okay.
the idea is that you're getting
An Inkscape.
yeah, sure. So he's not going to give you a 6-word definition of a classic.
Mm-hmm.
But assuming that that's where it came from, then he says that a classic is a work that requires a response from you, whether or not you like it.
Oh,
Which is
interesting.
really interesting to me, particularly thinking about the impulse to respond in later epics to the earlier epics. So,
Yes.
obviously, Virgil wasn't really buying the Iliad picture of the Trojan War.
Yeah. But
he is founding his own epic on that epic
yes.
and responding to it
And again,
by rejecting it, basically. But it called out a response in him.
that's interesting. Well, and then Dante it says like, well, obviously Virgil didn't get it because he's in hell, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he doesn't have special revelation, but he is the best of human reason, and so he wants to bring that in. Like he in a literal sense brings Virgil into his story. He says,
Mm-hmm.
"Come and tell the story with me."
Yeah, and in a way, like think about people talk all the time about why did Dante put Virgil in there? Why is he his guide? And there's all sorts of things you could get into there with pagan virtue and all sorts of complicated discussions. But think about if he had left him out in that world.
Yeah.
If Virgil wasn't in there, then there's potentially a gaping hole in there because you don't know where to fit these other foundation stories.
Yeah.
And Dante says firmly, this is where they go.
Yeah. That I've got to chew on that. It starts to give me the impression almost of it's more like a tree than some sort of like creation of man. It's like there's almost as though like there's a lot less freedom to write of epic. Well, it doesn't seem to be that much freedom to write an epic.
No, I mean there's giant gaps between the epics.
It's like here they are. Here, once every 1,000 years, once every 800 years, one of these is going to come out because finally everything lined up together to produce this thing.
Mm-hmm.
Let me see. Let's see if you can see
And
how this is related.
by the way, we didn't mention before, there are some modern epics, sometimes called that, and they're Wordsworth's Prelude.
Yes. Yeah.
And
yeah.
I think I've got this right. Whitman's Song of Myself, which I have not read. And
Oh.
so, there's some interesting things going on there with the epic moving toward
The person.
the person.
Yeah.
But, I wonder whether people will look at those in 300 years and say, well, yeah, the Prelude was the next epic after Paradise Lost.
Well, Charles
Or
Williams.
They will disappear into, not obscurity like they're going to disappear forever, but they're not going to be epics.
Okay, so Well, I was just gonna say Charles Williams is in his book on the figure of Beatrice, which is a great book about Dante. He's constantly putting the Divine Comedy and the Prelude up against each other and comparing them. And,
Okay.
and he thinks that the Prelude is, or would have been if finished, the next Divine Comedy, or the spiritual successor to the Divine Comedy. So, where nature has some correspondence to Beatrice, in the sense of it's not the transcendent glory in this Florentine woman, but rather in creation. And anyway, so it's interesting. Charles Williams is on that line. But okay, so this is going to take a second. I'm rereading this book by Daniel Toma on it's called Vestige of an Image of Eternity, and he's trying to reintroduce Aristotelian Thomistic thought into the world and say this is how we should be interpreting scientific data, is through the Aristotelian Thomistic framework of thought. Mm-hmm. And one of the points that he makes is that science is fundamentally based on common human experience. And so any aspect of science that denies the validity of common human experience, we have to figure out what that means, because it can't cut off its own foundation. But there's a line in there that he's talking about where he's talking about what's known versus unknown. And this is where I think is really relevant. He said, when we discovered that red light is emitted at, 507 nanometers of, like the wavelength of red light is 507 nanometers, we didn't discover what red light was. We already knew what red light was. And in fact, we couldn't know what the wavelength was unless we knew what red was. Mm-hmm. The knowledge of red presupposes any scientific knowledge of red. And so I was thinking about that as you're talking about epics, and I was also thinking about, poetry, the idea of poetry. You're talking about what makes a classic. And I was thinking what's so interesting about what makes a classic is you can come up with all these definitions, but ultimately it comes down to how well does that correspond to what I know to be true, which is a classic. Like, I know that classics exist. Let's see if I can come up with a definition to match that. But you're not figuring out what a classic is when you define one. You're also not figuring out what an epic is when you define one. You can point to it, and you might draw the circle a little bit differently. But it's just interesting that an epic is a thing that we have a knowledge of, and you could come to different definitions of it, but that doesn't change that we know what it is, and we'll recognize them when we see them.
Well, it's sort of a general principle, and this sort of gets into some legal stuff as well, but definitions don't really matter until you get to the edge cases.
Yes.
Because in the center, no one asks what the definition is, they already know what it is.
Yeah. So then it makes me feel a lot more comfortable saying, yeah, here's these epics. Fine, we can contest the edge cases, right? Is the Lord of the Rings an epic? Maybe. But, like, what's weird is that's grounded in the knowledge that, like, we already know, here they are, they're doing these things to us. It is interesting to me, too, and I don't know, I wish that I should go and look at this, but, like, sort of the other uses of the word epic. Do you know which came first? Did we apply the word epic to this kind of writing because we found it epic, and now we also use epic for all these other things, and it's slang, young person slang? Or did the idea of epic being this great, grand, awe-inspiring thing come out of people writing in that way?
I do not know. Gut instinct is that we applied it to the poems first.
Yeah, interesting. So let's kind of, as we're finishing up, I'll just give my recommendation on reading epic poetry, which my first recommendation is do it. My second recommendation is, and this is interesting, and maybe you can draw something out of this, I think the best way to read epic poetry is to just read it. It's to not like try to study it initially, not try to figure out even really what's going on, but just like, it's something almost like language immersion, which is interesting to me. It's not like studying a textbook. It's not like studying theology or philosophy or history. There's something about get through it as quickly as you can, get as much of it into you as you can. What do you think about that? Like, do you think that has anything to do with what an epic is?
Well, I think that if you don't do it like that, then you're very unlikely to actually make it all the way through. One of the things that I think comes out in that is that epics are wholes, like with a W.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Mm-hmm.
you don't actually know the epic until you've read the whole thing. And I don't mean like if you skip a book in the middle of the Odyssey that you're going to lose the whole experience. But I do mean that they, you know, they progress, and the Iliad doesn't end in the same place that it started, and if you don't know how it ends, then you don't know what the significance of the beginning is.
Yeah.
And that movement, I think, from beginning to end is vital to the epic because it's not.
It's not a snapshot.
Yeah.
That reminds me of, I don't know if you remember talking about this, but there's an article that we came across in our family several years ago about a retired fireman who decided he was going to memorize as much of Paradise Lost as he could. You remember this?
I don't. I didn't remember that he was a retired fireman, but I do remember somebody memorizing all of Paradise Lost.
Well, the point was that he was just, an everyman. He was anyone,
Mm-hmm.
and so I think he did it while he was walking on the treadmill for multiple hours a day. But the thing that he said was that having memorized it, it was like he had a cathedral in his head that he could walk through.
Mm.
Which, yeah, that's the right word. Exactly. That's the response that I take to it too. I actually really like your point about them being a whole, because maybe that's part of what is so powerful about them, is that they force us to realize that in some sense everything that we're in is part of a whole. And so it takes our eyes up from, here I am in this one place at this one time. And there's actually two quotes that I can think of from Dante that I can't quote, but I could give you from the Divine Comedy, where he talks about, one of them is in the Circle of Purgatory, where there, I believe it's envy, and no, it's greed, and they're staked face down on the ground, so they can't look up at heaven. That's their purgation, so they don't get to look at the stars. And he has this inviction against them, saying, how can you not turn your eyes to heaven to see, these wondrous marvels that God has caused to spin out across the universe? And that's sort of like the anti-epic right there, is the person who's staked out with their face to the ground and all they can see is the dirt. Mm-hmm. Which reminds me of, so I have a particular affection in my heart for Job and Beowulf. Job, I'm going to give the honorary title of epic, and Beowulf, they're close cousins in my mind. And on the Beowulf side, all the credit goes to Tolkien's interpretation and The Monsters and the Critics, where he brings out that the weird time structure of it is not an accident. It's not a crudity of the writing, but actually a piece of masterwork. That you would have Beowulf in his prime slaying the monsters and bringing about the golden day of the Danes. Is it the Danes, or is he a Dane?
Been too long.
He brings about the golden age, and there's peace and the drinking halls in its glory. And then you don't get any of that. You just go from him slaying Grendel's mother straight to decrepit Beowulf, hobbling off his throne with no one beside him to go fight the dragon. And yes, he kills the dragon, but he's slain at the same time. And that, and Job, because both of those stories have this unusual bookend structure, where what they're doing is they start you somewhere, and they put you all the way at the end somewhere, and they make you look at the fact that pretty much all of our life is somewhere right in the middle. Mm-hmm. And you can't get away from it. Job is, they're sort of the yin and yang of each other narratively, because Job there's almost nothing on the bookends. They're just like bare minimum. Here it is. We get you going, and then the whole thing is we're sitting in the middle of Job's destitution and trying to figure out what happened. And the whole point is that you shouldn't figure out what happened. You should wait. And Beowulf is kind of the opposite, because Beowulf is in his glory, but it ultimately doesn't matter that he can rip Grendel apart but with his bare hands and slay Grendel's mother down in the bog in her bog lair, because man apart from God grows old and dies, the dragons come and the darkness returns. And so they're like the shadow and the light of each other in some sense, because Job, he's destitute, and then there's all this arguing about why that happens, and he's raised up to glory, and he's restored. And those are sort of the two to in my own head. Those are the two things that, like, you kind of have to live with those all the time. That is, your life is somewhere in the middle of Job, and it's somewhere in the middle of Beowulf at the same time. Sometimes it's more Job, and sometimes it's more Beowulf. But I think when you read them and you sit with it, you don't read it as something to extract stuff from. You don't read it as, I mean, sure, you can learn a lot historically and poetically and all that's great, but when it's something that you have the humility to come and live inside of, I think it gives you a chance to have a wisdom that exceeds one human life or even 100 human lifetimes, and you get to see a story that's bigger than yourself and realize that you're part of it.
Well, you obviously intended that as a perfect wrap-up, so we'll end there.